Thank you very much for being with us today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's just so lovely to be here. It was such an honor to be invited to come share my work in this amazing, enlivening context full of people thinking about poetry and attention in all kinds of different ways. And congratulations on your project. It's just such an interesting set of questions that you're asking, and I'm looking forward to conversing more with everyone here about the intersections between this project and some of the stuff I'm thinking about, in relationship between, or in terms of the relationship between ecological and poetic attention. So, from the view, I've changed my glasses. If you can just imagine yourself with me for a moment in the river valley of Edmonton, Alberta, Amiskwachim, Muskegon, Treaty 6 territory, Region 4 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. That is where I'm from. That is where increasingly my scholarly attention is turning. Okay, for the moment, it is winter. And then the North Saskatchewan River Valley, including the river's frozen surface, is covered in snow. Up above, on either side of its steep banks, the city buzzes with life. But here, on a quiet path in the middle of the afternoon, in the slanted sunlight, the business of 1 million people going about their day is a distant hum. As I round the bend of a wooded ravine, however, I am startled by another kind of business unfolding. A coyote crouches over the snow, eyes focused intently on a square foot of space between her paws, statue still, but ready to pounce on whatever critter is scurrying beneath. A few feet above this scene, a magpie paces on the leafless branch of a balsam poplar. He too watches intently, nattering in anticipation of leftovers. Suddenly, at some sign imperceptible to me, the coyote leaps high in the air, arcs her body downward, and lands in an explosion of snow. Quick scuffle, then palpable disappointment, as the critter apparently eludes the coyote's grasp. Magpie scolds, I stand still, awestruck by the intensity of life I've just witnessed. To me, this scene is singular, a rare gift that jolts me out of the mundane preoccupations of my urban existence, the pace of which leaves little time to contemplate what is happening outside the doors of my house or the university where I work. But to the coyote, the magpie, the rodent under the snow, this encounter could not have been more ordinary, a common theme of daily life. Edmonton is home to more than 2,000 coyotes who must, after all, find food. Pausing to observe this more than human community draws me out of my own sense of time and place and into another within which I am entangled, but of which I am nonetheless mostly ignorant. And yet this scene unfolded a 10-minute walk from my house. And when dusk falls, or when sirens wail on the busy road up above, sometimes many more coyotes howl and yip, filling the air with a liveliness more often heard than seen, but which I am liable to forget when they fall silent again. Encounters with non-human natures are at once unique, they tend to stop us in our tracks, and, if we pay attention, remarkably common. For those who can get outside and who have the time to pause and notice. The richness and diversity of life can bring daily astonishment, whether in sublime or in more intimate forms. A moose surprising my husband on a morning run in the river valley, migrating sandhill cranes riding the updrafts thousands of feet above the city, a fox resting or waiting for a jackrabbit under our blue spruce, a colony of ants relocating from one side of the yard to another expertly transporting their eggs in an orderly march. A native yellow orchid popping up unexpectedly in a neglected, damp and shady corner of our garden. When I begin to catalog encounters with a world that is much more than of our own making, I'm quickly overwhelmed with the teeming life that persists even in this heavily urbanized place, even as we know that biodiversity is declining. My larger project, Everyday Natures, from which I draw this talk today, is animated by encounters with the other creatures with whom I share my habitat. It's inspired by these webs of relations: coyote, magpie, rodent, snow, grass, mud, bank, sun, poplar, river, human, among so many others that are in constant dynamic interaction each day, whether we notice them or not. My book's central questions combine my interest in these ecologies of relations with my preoccupation as a literary scholar with language. After all, words too are part of our habitat. We inhabit language and literature much as we do landscapes, architecture, and weather. In addition to plants and animals, soil and rock, tools and cherished objects we live among, the languages we speak, the stories and poems we read, the songs we sing, the names we use, these words emplace us, defining our sense of home and shaping our ecological imaginaries. Habitat studies, a methodology that guides my work on everyday natures, brings ecology and literary studies together in a way that reorients our attention to the world. Developed by Canadian literary scholar Lucy Alford a couple of decades ago, habitat studies is a bioregional approach to literary scholarship that, quote, shifts eco-criticism's dominating emphasis from place towards a system of animals and plants, water and soil. In books such as the Arbutus Madrone Files and Salau, Listening for the Northwest Understory, Riku created new kinds of literary histories, perhaps better described as literary ecologies, that converge not around those human-centered frameworks such as place, author, genre, or literary movements, but around other species and elements that define his habitat in the Pacific Northwest. Things like Salau, salmon, arbutus, and rain. This reorientation of literary attention also broadens our sense of what it means to read. Habitat studies expands the reading practices of literary scholars to include biology and natural history, among other forms of ecological writing. And most radically, habitat studies invites us to listen, and I'm quoting here from Riku, to what the world outside of human language systems might be saying. This turn outward decenters not just the human subject, but also the very languages we speak. Through this approach in my recent work on considering my own habitat in the parkland of central Alberta, not only to look and listen for the organisms that share it with me, but also to be guided by them into new modes of thinking, reading, writing, and inhabiting the world and this ecological moment. This practice has taken me and my students outside the classroom, down into the river valley that forms a natural boundary along the north side of the U of A campus, and into other parts of our collective backyard, including my own. The chapters of my book sit with an eclectic collection of organisms that have guided my reading and thinking about this habitat: caragana, bison, chickadee, grasses, and yes, lichen. So today I chose to focus on lichen because of the particular pressure that it places on this topic of attention. Lichens are found in every biome, flourishing on many of the Earth's surfaces, from the barks of trees to tundra soils, desert sands, and rock faces. They make their homes among people, too, on wooden fences, concrete and stone walls, rooftop shingles, and gravestones. Lichen is complex, hard to define. Formed by cooperations between cyanobacteria, otherwise known as algae, and fungi, lichens generated the term symbiosis. They have been described as composite or cosmopolitan organisms. As one lovely metaphor describes it, a lichen is what happens when a fungus hugs an algae and doesn't let go. This relationship is more complicated than it sounds. As assemblages that challenge notions of individuality, of species, even of kingdoms, lichens are best understood, according to Merlin Sheldrake, as, quote, dynamic systems rather than a catalog of interacting components. These systems create varied forms, whether foliose or leaf-like, crystose, like dried cracking paint, or fruticose, shrubby, bushy, or resembling coral. These forms can be oddly beautiful. In her poem Pastoral, Karen Soley describes being floored by lichen's radial grace. Along with the incisive liquor of juniper, lichen moves her speaker with its sign that beauty endures. Even in this disturbed parkland overrun with noxious weeds. Eric Ormsby dedicates a whole poem to the diverse shapes and textures of lichen growing next to the Atlantic Ocean. Their surfaces are gray, dry, and crinkly, he writes. Some are cracked and sharp or flake away like weathered paint in strips. Their odor is fiercer than the sea's. Their drab arabesques look splotchy, rust-wept, or scaly as dead bark. Far off, they're star-like, spiky as galaxies. Lichen metaphors link its microtopographies to macrocosms. Ormsby's drab arabesques join other figures conjuring celestial realms. Lichens appear star-like, spiky as galaxies, erupting in explosions and cosmic maps. At the other end of this aesthetic spectrum, they become Lilliputian landscapes. I've seen waterfalls as small as my tears pool in forests of thin lichens, writes Patrick Lane. On another aesthetic spectrum altogether are metaphors comparing lichens to blight and skin disease. They are splotches and scabs, or the crusted cliff snot in Ken Babstock's ironic ode to lichen. Such images convey the distaste that a fastidious breed of gardeners seems to have for lichens, some even purchasing antifungal sprays that will clear these unsightly things off the tree trunks in their yards, many mistakenly believing that lichens are parasites that damage the tree that hosts them, which they do not. Despite their ubiquity and sometimes striking aesthetics, lichens often go unnoticed, neglected biodiversity, according to some. Neglected perhaps because they are so very different from us, faceless beings, and so remote from our sensibilities, so difficult to comprehend. As Christopher Maines has written, not everyone likes being likened to lichen. Apparently, lichen brings us to the limits of empathy as well as language. They can quite simply be difficult to see. In the parkland and prairie biomes I inhabit, their presence is subtle. I notice lichens only when I pause and lean in close to tree trunk, boulder, or fence posts speckled with their gray, green, or rusty orange colonies. Lichen creates intricate layers of life in unexpected places, including undisturbed soil. To notice these lichens is to commit to the minute and hidden. It is to focus on faceless beings that tend to be eclipsed by charismatic species that more easily command our attention, rather than quietly awaiting it. And so I wonder, how often do we pass by lichens without even noticing they are there? They can be overlooked in literature as well as on land.
A reader might easily miss it, for instance, in the 5th stanza of another of Soli's poems, Parallax, where the speaker laments, "The government once saw fit to give this land away, there being only grass and Indians on it. Stones from teepee rings host lichen in the rock piles as corporations draw a bead on the flyover zone, posing buyouts like questions to those for whom there are none." In these lines, lichen does not leap off the page in a bold metaphor, but it is there, tenaciously generating life among the stones left behind by indigenous nations who are also neglected, displaced, and dispossessed by this colonial government. So what does it mean to notice, or not to notice, the lichens growing in Soli's rock piles? What are they doing there, poetically and ecologically? Their presence opens up questions about how to read the land, as well as the poem itself. Specifically, what modes of attention might resist ongoing acts of colonial and ecological neglect and exploitation that these lines draw into parallel relation. Is a reader who skims over the lichen's quiet presence here part of the same system that neglects nations historically reduced to, quote, only Indians? One of the imperatives of habitat studies is to notice not only when and how these organisms from our more than human communities show up in literature, as lichen does here, but also how they might guide our attention and thinking. From this methodological perspective, the questions I've just asked echo a broader one that Vincent Zonka poses in his intricate, meandering discussion of lichens in life and art. How to learn from this quiet, immobile life. And it's his emphasis on how rather than what he can learn that I find instructive. I like how it turns the question from content, from the what, towards disposition and method, or the how. It prompts us to consider what is required in order to learn from these collaborative, slow-growing organisms that challenge conventional ways of understanding the more than human world. Even scientists have been stymied by lichens' ways of being. Sheldrake points out that lichens explode many of the categories that humans have used to understand the world. To think, we once thought they were plants. We once thought they were individuals. They were neither of those things. And we still don't entirely know what to make of their peculiar ways. As Sheldrake writes, lichens annihilate our categories of gender. They reshape our ideas of community and cooperation. They screw up our hereditary model of evolutionary descent. They utterly liquidate our notions of time. Lichens can crumble rocks into dust with their terrifying acids. They're the biggest organisms in the world and among the oldest. They're world makers and world breakers. So there's a lot to attend to then in Soli's rock piles, which I'll go back to. To learn from lichens, both in the rock piles of Soli's poem about capitalist abuses of land and people, and along many of the Earth's other surfaces where lichen too easily escapes our attention, we need to abandon the God's eye view of flyover zones and land surveys and get closer to the Earth, an Earth whose meanings in this poem are obscured by the cartographic logic of capitalism. We need to walk on, as the poem's speaker does, eyes to the ground. It's how I think, Soli writes. Eyes to the ground, Soli's speaker reminds us that writing can be a close reading of the world, as Helena Feder puts it. As I often remind my students, and I'm sure you do too, close reading is slow reading. To walk with our eyes to the ground, we need to slow down. We need, in other words, to be more like lichens. Growing at a rate of only 0.5 to 5 millimeters per year, lichens model what Zonka calls an ethics of slowness. To our human eyes, lichens barely grow at all. They are an image of stillness and deep time. Are Solis lichens a marker of the time that has passed since these stones were last handled by humans? Lichen needs, after all, to be left alone to grow. It is neglected biodiversity that flourishes in neglected places. Through them, the reader can feel at once the proximity and the distance between the present and the past. The poem's experience of time and place expands. I want to turn for a moment to a poem by another prairie poet, George Amabile, in which lichen occasions a particular kind of pause that helps me think through this phenomenon of expansive time from a slightly different angle. Near the end of the poem First Light, the poet is arrested by a memory of lichen. I don't know why I think of Patrick in Swift Current, he muses. The stone he brought home like a lost pet, and the stone's lichen, exactly the color of glacial till, but white at the edges, like a drying lake seen from the top of a mountain. This memory interrupts an extended metaphysical contemplation of the mind's confrontation with reality, the depths of human history, and origin stories. Although, as one of the first forms of life on land, they go back like at least 400 million years apparently, the lichen connects symbolically to each of these things. And yet the sudden, apparently inexplicable surfacing of this memory also creates an opening in the poem, as it does in the poet's mind, that at once slows and focuses our perception of time and place in the present. The poet's recollection of Patrick, Lane, I presume, from the connection to Swift Current, of the stone, of the lichen that Patrick later sprinkles with water to keep alive, catches the randomness as well as the sacredness of life's encounters. Friend with friend, poet with memory, lichen with rock. All these life forces converge on the poem that for a moment holds them. Remember, lichen is collaborative. And it is figured here through another convergence, as the lichen's small form and coloring evokes for the poet a lake viewed from a distance, another aerial view, but this time not from a flyover, but from the top of a mountain, a view, in other words, that one must have worked for, the reward of a slow and steady ascent. The dilation and superimposition of time and place here that accompanies this pause in the poem are features of the kind of immersive experience that I think we often associate with literature, and perhaps especially poetry. An experience of reading not for a quick gleaning of content, but rather reading as an experience of richly layered perception, of depth and thickness of being. I can't help but dilate my own sense of place and time here by opening up this reading of prairie lichens to an insight I've carried with me since my undergrad days here at McGill, and this was a long time ago. I am thinking of the late Victorian aesthete Walter Pater's famous description of the value of art, which lies in expanding that interval, in getting as many pulsations as possible into the given and limited time we have on Earth. While lichens might seem an unlikely carrier of the, quote, great passions that Pater associates with art, Pater's teacher, John Ruskin, painted them with the kind of loving attention that Pater would later give to the texture of hair or cloth in a Renaissance painting. And why not lichen? A recent study by a group of psychologists in Finland confirms that being in nature also seems to slow and expand our sense of time. The reasons for this would seem to be connected to nature's own alternate rhythms, which for lichens, as we've seen, are especially slow, whether relative to our own. Imagine, writes the Canadian ecological poet Don Mackay, a trail made of moments rather than minutes, wild bits of time which resist elapsing according to a schedule, pauses. The poet J.R. Carpenter was the writer-in-residence at the University of Alberta from 2020 to 21, during the most locked-down year of the pandemic. Experienced almost entirely in a basement apartment and on Zoom, there was nothing in person on campus that year, Carpenter's writing residency had a different temporal and social rhythm than most do. To escape this isolation and online work, Carpenter developed a daily practice of walking in the river valley. This practice generated poetic records of what might be well described as wild bits of time. Carpenter turned these poems into zines, one of which is illustrated with drawings of lichens. She titled it This Slowly. And here's a few images from it. It's a really, really beautiful little piece. In this poem, the illustrations make lichen the guiding principle, not sky or elm tree or river ice, which the poem also features. Carpenter's drawings direct attention to smallness, to the lichen on the beetle-eaten branch alongside the long embrace of elm trees, for instance, and to a stillness that pushes against the norms of human activity. No one wants to move this slowly. Okay, rather than reading the whole poem out to you, I would like us to read it together, collaboratively, one word at a time. This is the little activity that Miranda was alluding to. I am inspired to do this by Alexis Pauline Gumbs' meditation on slowness in her book, Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals. Pretty far from lichens, but still. This book has activities aligned with each of its chapters, and you can see her instructions for the chapter Slow Down here. As Carpenter reflects on what she witnesses in the river valley during a period of what was in some ways a radical slowing down, her heavily punctuated lines enact a slowness of poetic language, thought, and action. This reading practice that Gumbs gives us slows our experience of her words down even more. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to read it together. We can't, usually it's good to do this in a circle, but we can't do that. But so what I think we should do is just move from the back and just kind of like snake along the lines of chairs. And the instructions are for each person to read just one word, and then the next person reads the next word, and so on. But you must resist temptation to read all the words between her periods, even though there aren't very many of them. You really must read only one word at a time, even if that word is of. That's your word, so you just inhabit it. All right, are we ready? Yes.
Are we going all the way across, or just one segment of that?
South back.
Start at the back, and let's go all the way across.
Okay.
And then wind. So you have to pay attention to the words, and you have to pay attention to your neighbors. So, okay?
Yeah. This. Slowly. Listening.
2.
Moving.
River.
Ice.
Nothing. Is.
This.
Progress.
This.
Companion.
Absence. This. Dripping.
This. Shattering.
A.
Woodpecker. Ratata. Cracking.
Beetle dead.
Branches.
Silver.
With.
Lichen.
Layers.
Bark.
Are we over?
Of.
Wet.
Beautiful. Keep going, let's just go back.
Of.
Bark.
Of.
Wood.
Of. Silt.
Of.
Wait. The.
Wounds.
Where. Ice.
Came.
Crashing down river.
Yacking.
Living.
Spruce.
Standing.
Still.
Noticing.
The.
Contested. Boundary.
Between.
Mark.
And.
Not.
There's more! Keep going, we'll just go back and forth.
Leaf. And.
Rot.
Mounting. At.
Mud.
In.
This.
Right.
Place.
The.
Amount.
Of.
Blue.
It.
Takes.
Two.
Fold.
These.
Folds.
The. Oh, sorry.
The. Amount.
Of. White.
In.
Takes.
Up.
Space.
What?
Is. This.
Sky. Trying. To. Hide.
A.
Solar. Halo.
Barely.
Discernible.
Hollow.
At.
The.
Base.
Of. And.
Elm.
Tree. The.
Creeks.
And. Groans. Of. To. Elm.
Trees.
Leaning.
Chafing.
Scraping.
Growing.
Into. One.
Ongoing.
Violence.
Of.
This.
Long.
Embrace.
No one wants to.
This.
Slowly.
Thank you. So you can really feel it, okay? No one wants to move this slowly, but you did, and some beautiful things happen when you do. And I hope that in some conversation afterwards, some of you might share your thoughts and your experience of reading this poem in this way, which I think of as very lichen-like, both slow and collaborative. Thank you for that. I actually have more. I have more things to say before we. I wanted to move to this idea of an ethics of slowness, because it was when I started teaching habitat studies and teaching some of these practices that I realized how rare certain kinds of slow practice are in academia, even in a discipline that values close and careful attention to texts. I'd like to tell you a story about one of the students in the first seminar I facilitated in the spirit of Riku's method, Janice Viz. Embracing the random potential of habitat studies, Janice drew her non-human guide for the term out of a hat. She got nuthatch. She figured it must be a plant. One of the first things she learned was that it wasn't. A nuthatch is a bird, or rather two birds, white-breasted and red-breasted. Over the course of the term, this bird drew Janice into various branches and seeds of research, some of which became central to a project, some of which she cached in much the same way that nuthatches cache seeds in the deep crevices of tree bark to be digested at some future time. She also followed these birds outside the texts and walls of the library, listening for their distinctive nasal calls in the forests and tree-lined streets of Edmonton, where she would sit, waiting, listening, and watching. At first, this practice seemed antithetical to what was required of her as a graduate student in English, and she wrote about this. "Wasn't I wasting valuable research reading and writing time?" she wrote. "Shouldn't I be working, or at least doing something?" Janice's anxious sense that she was wasting time speaks to the power of a particular colonial narrative of progress that has, according to my colleague, the Papaschase Cree scholar Dwayne Donald, usurped our educational system by narrowly dictating what it means to study and what it means to learn. And I would add, even what it means to read. But while Janice was out there worrying that she was doing nothing, she was learning new ways of reading, thinking about, and relating to the world. This practice of waiting and listening has a kinship with the quiet practices of attention that Jenny Odell describes in her book, How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, that was mentioned earlier today. To do nothing, Odell writes, is to hold yourself still so that you can perceive what is actually there. And what is there, as anyone who sits long enough to notice will tell you, is a whole wonderful, messy confluence of life of which we are a part. To perceive this confluence is to experience what Stacey Alamo describes as creaturely immersion that fills in the gaps between us and other beings, alleviating the species' loneliness that has become a troubling symptom of the Anthropocene. It is maybe then not surprising that Janice later described this habitat studies practice as, quote, life-giving. I took her to mean this literally. Life, after all, is entangled, enmeshed, a knot of relationships. Reading and writing can bring us deeper into it. Despite the academic freedom I possess in my teaching and research, slowing down remains oddly difficult. Even here, to move slowly is to push against the, quote, ruthless accelerations of late modernity that Paul Hübner in Nature's Broken Clocks and Odell in her more recent work, especially Saving Time, describe with alarm. But slowing down has perhaps never been more urgent. According to the Nehiyaw scholar and poet Tasha Beeds, to slow down is also to resist the, quote, measured pace of colonization. It is perhaps to then go beyond settler time, as Mark Rifkin describes it in his book by that title. Slowing down has become necessary to our very survival, as resource extraction and fossil fuel consumption outpaces ecological processes of regeneration and carbon sequestration, as well as treating our addictions to energy, convenience, speed, escape, and of course, stuff. We need time to think clearly, to collaborate meaningfully, to listen attentively, and to change how we are in the world, to build communities and relationships in ways that might actually sustain us and our non-human kin. Lichens teach us about relationships too. Remember, they are collaborative. One of their lessons, according to Robin Wall Kimmerer, is that when times are easy and there's plenty to go around, individual species can go it alone. But when conditions are harsh and life is tenuous, it takes a team sworn to reciprocity to keep it going forward. In a world of scarcity, interconnection and mutual aid become critical for survival. So say the lichens, she writes. I agree with Kimmerer that this seems like a good lesson for scholars working in this era of climate change and ecological depletion. One of the reasons we need to slow down is so that we can talk more to one another, collaborate across disciplines to find better ways of living. It is also perhaps about figuring out ways to extend our thinking, reading, and being outward to the non-human beings who might offer new forms of poetic attention that is more intimately connected to where and with whom we live. Following lichens, I think in entanglements. At first, this thinking comes in similes. Birdwatching is a lot like reading poetry. Being a scholar is like lichenizing. But similes imply a sort of besideness, a neat mirroring or refracted reflection in water. For contact, for overlap, for contested boundaries between bark and knot, as Carpenter puts it, we need metaphor. How about we are all lichens? This metaphor began with a couple of biologists in an article called A Symbiotic View of Life, in which they argued there have never been individuals. It now echoes through lichen literature, including Queer Theory for Lichens by David Griffiths, Donna Haraway's Staying with the Troubled, and other places. The metaphor registers a number of entanglements that fascinate us, including that our own bodies are not distinct entities, but are host to and reliant upon countless of other little critters. That we are lichens is also a critical ecological insight that is both everywhere apparent in our current crisis and must become central to our understanding of who we are in the world if we have any hopes of correcting the dangerous individualism that has led us here. As a literary scholar, I like the way this metaphor makes me think about reading and writing as porous, collaborative practices. And I hear we're gonna hear a collaborative practice of poetry later. I like the way it makes me think about intertextuality and citation, about polyphony and influence, about interspecies reciprocity, about writing not just as a close reading of the world, as Fetter put it, but as a collaboration with it. Janice's attention to the red-breasted nuthatch nurtured a profound care for the bird that helped her to relate to it not just as a subject, but in effect as a kind of co-creator. Influenced by the nuthatch's peculiar movements, she experimented with forms of thinking, reading, and writing that disrupted taken-for-granted grammars and structures of the essay. So here's an example of one way that she experimented with the structures of both language and thought. After learning that nuthatches can move both up and down tree trunks, they're one of the few birds that can do that, Janice began flipping her own text upside down and revisiting ideas from another perspective. But to be a nuthatch, she first had to be lichened. Thank you.
One of the essays that you've written, which you spoke to briefly,
called Migrations, which you published during COVID time, has been immensely influential on what Poetry Matters has been doing. And among much else, you're thinking about the proximities between forms of reading that we might associate with poetry and then reading nature, reading birds, listening to birds. And so I just want to acknowledge that that has been in our thinking and in our practice. But let me open things up to people here, comments that people might have.
How did you feel during that reading practice, by the way? And you didn't have to like it. So don't be shy. Yeah.
Well, I felt that this, in the process, the meaning was breaking down. And so as a teacher of reading, I fight against very slow reading, not close reading, slow reading, because I see how slow reading breaks down the meaning. And the point of reading is communication of meaning. So that's how, for me, it was very, I lost the whole meaning of that poem, so
it became fragmented.
yes, too fragmented.
But I would add to that, which is true to my experience as well, that at the same time, words like, and you kind of primed us for this a little bit, but words like this and of became so large. They became all the sounds that are made in the throat when you say those single syllable things that we don't think of as meaning very much.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated that. And of course, this was a deliberate anaphora in the poem, but I appreciated hearing just how much it was one when we said those words individually.
Yeah, I just wanted to extend these comments. So it felt like in some ways maybe the larger poem became fragmented, but then it felt like it now had 1,000 poems within it. Like each word or each phrase or a line could have been a poem. And I'm also just reflecting on the fact that I had this expectation that we had a specific direction for how to read it, and I think I unintentionally broke down that direction, so like I quote unquote messed it up. And so, how do we think about a collaborative process that gets messed up? Is it still a collaborative process, or is it somehow less than?
That,
So
yeah,
I'm
that
just
takes
curious
in
about
error or what feels
Right.
like divergence.
Like
yeah.
mutations.
Yep, mutations. Yeah, mutations.
I thought there was almost like an underlying primitive ritual going on. We don't usually read like that, but it
Yeah.
seemed to harken back to like old religions, old beliefs.
And we were finding our way back into that.
I actually really enjoyed the moments when we skipped lines by accident.
Too.
Because then you're like, this or some people just read the cues and just skip that person and someone takes over. And that way I think it strengthens the idea of community.
Yeah.
Because of that little way
Yeah.
just kind of help out.
Yeah, you could feel people reading each other and
Together.
adapting.
I felt that.
You're very back
So I think that just read it word by word is like a kind of mindfulness practice. So you need to focus on this moment, but not just thinking about what will we eat later or what in the past. Yeah, and a question, because I have no background in English literature or my background is digital infrastructure. So a reading in our class is about to see nature as infrastructure. So when we say infrastructure, we say one characteristic, one feature of infrastructure is invisibility. Just like the light. I don't know how. Yeah. I just search it and so I know the meaning of it. But so when we are learning infrastructure and its invisibility, we found a lot of time, like all of those things, like the pipes, those things are not invisible, is invisible
Yeah.
only when they break down. You
Oh,
notice
yeah.
that,
When it comes to-
right?
Yeah.
When they break down, you notice that. And like I have this question, what is the first time you notice this?
Lichens?
Yeah.
That is such a good question. Of course, I'm gonna lie, like, I don't know. But what I think of when I think of lichen is an image of the lichens that grow on this huge rock face above a lake in the Canadian Shield, where I'm lucky enough to go every summer. And we paddle our canoe over, and it's just like an ancient crumbling fresco. Like, the colors are amazing, and it's just beautiful. And I feel like that's kind of where I first noticed lichen as a kind of aesthetic, beauty in the landscape that made me kind of wonder why some poets were describing them as like skin diseases, right? Like, they just seem so beautiful to me. And then when I started seeking them out closer to my home on the prairies, where they aren't splashed over very, big visible rock faces, but they're kind of in these crevices and stuff. I did start thinking about attention in a different way because of that kind of juxtaposition between when they're very visible and when they are not.
I found it a really interesting practice in attention. I found that I could focus on there was sort of three different things to pay attention to. One's place in the room and the text, and I found that I could kind of often only focus on one of those things.
Yeah, in some ways it was not that slow at all, right? Because you're thinking.
It was sort of a flow, or then I would be oh, there's this, and then wait, where is it again? Oh.
Yeah.
So I found that really interesting, and I guess with this sort of the whole lichen talk in general, something I got from it a bit was as somebody with ADHD, I find a bit that so we're saying we gotta all slow down and be lichen and stuff, and sometimes I find that I'm a bit stuck in the lichen state or something already, which I guess has its benefits, but it can be a little frustrating in the world where everybody, indeed, nobody wants to move this slowly, and sometimes a little bit stuck like that. So it was neat to see this kind of appreciation for that.
Yeah.
There were some comments here.
Okay. Just drawing on the relative perspicacity of lichens, it seems to me that part of you mentioned, I think very early in the talk, that part of what's needed for lichens to survive is to kind of be not noticed. And I'm wondering, which is kind of ironic too, because they also seem to survive in these extreme temperatures. They're amazing survivors.
Yeah.
But also their survival is sometimes dependent on not being noticed. I'm wondering how we ought to become lichens in that respect. When are the times when we want to kind of divert attention away and kind of be doing the attention?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. I'm gonna have to mull that over and think over lunch. Do you have an answer to it?
I don't accept that as structurally, as academics.
Yeah.
I guess there's sabbatical maybe if you're so lucky. You can become in the middle of nowhere somewhere, but otherwise, you're expected to kind of be part of this this very visible community.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about in that way too, and about how how much thinking happens, kind of undercover. A little bit,
And protected away from.
Yeah.
There were comments here, let's see, there's here first? Yeah, for here first and then here. Okay, I'm on this.
Thanks so much for this talk. It was really lovely. I found myself a little stressed during the reading practice, and it was teaching me something about my desires for control in collaborative environments. So that was some good self-reflection I was able to do. But I wanted to, and I really loved the comment about digital architecture. I was really admiring the photos that you had throughout the talk, and connecting a little bit with some of the opening remarks about thinking about poetic attention and your notes on habitat studies, looking at landscapes and environments, perhaps the way we might look at a poem, outside of a sort of extractive desire. And I was thinking about kind of poetic enjambment, like within a single line, these two things. And in so many of the photos, we have these clash of textures and colors, these moments that maybe don't feel like they should go together, but they are together and something incredible happens. And so I guess I just wanted to invite you to think a little bit more about this language of infrastructure and the way we might think about the structure of a poetic line and the structure of these textures that come together. There's something about the collaborative process that is really symbiotic, but something else that brings two kind of distinct things together in like an event of encounter. So there's some language and thoughts for you to play with maybe just for a moment.
Okay, that's great. I love all that. Thank you. You know, one thing I was thinking about when you were talking about infrastructure and how we don't see it until it doesn't work, was even the infrastructures of language that we became aware of in that process of reading the ofs and this and as kind of significant words, and the ways in which how maybe those words function a little bit the way like lichen does in an ecosystem to support the life of the other words kind of on top of and around it, because Robin Wall Kimmerer also has this beautiful description of lichens that colonize a rock in the best kind of way, not displacing other life, but you know, kindly creating opportunities for other life to inhabit, you know, these crevices and holding moisture for mosses that then grow and then plants grow and so on. And eventually the lichens become invisible. And I think eventually they ultimately actually, they don't disappear, but they become kind of part of these other organisms. They're not really even lichens, they're not lichenizing in the same way anymore because they can't photosynthesize and because they're covered up. And so they literally become a kind of infrastructure for life. And so thinking about, you know, how structures of sentences and lines of poetry do that too. But the enjambment you're talking about, that sort of juxtaposition, those kinds of encounters are also really interesting to think about.
I love that thought, thank you.
Gets us beyond the individual words. We have a couple of comments here, and then
Hi, it's a pleasure to meet you. I was wondering, what is your approach to artifice or artificiality in relation to nature writing? Because nature writing forces us really not just to look at the biosphere and the environment, but also our constructed realities. I mean, we're here in a room, confined to a certain time during the day. And so I'm wondering, how do you understand artifice?
That's a great question that just calls to mind Timothy Morton's point that all poems are ecological, right? Because all of them are situated in the world, and all of them rely on air and light and weather and, you know, water and all kinds of things, right? So they're, I am drawn, I admit, to poetry that moves outside of rooms, for now. And I take my students outside, and I really, you know, I'm convinced by some of my colleagues. Dwayne Donald is one of them who argues for, you know, rethinking education by recontextualizing it, sort of taking it out of the classroom. And And so I think I seek out words that do that also very explicitly. And so, yeah, so I haven't thought very much about artifice that is maybe, but I should, like that, or you should, and then we should collaborate.
I record myself, so I deal with it constantly, because it's really interesting when you write a poem. Yes, there is that idea of slowing time down in order to take back control, but then you also in the artifice yourself.
Yeah.
So we're trying to exert control, and yet we're confined within this thing that we create for ourselves.
So
it's kind of like an enslavement sort of.
Yeah, absolutely. There's do you know the poet Christine Stewart? She's an experimental poet. She was living in Edmonton for a long time. Now she's in Vancouver. She wrote a book called Treaty 6 Deixis. And it's about Treaty 6, and it's about, she's a descendant of settlers, and it's about, thinking through and really grappling with her colonial relationship to the land and how to think about treaty responsibility and obligations to the land and to the people and the beings we are first. And one of the things she does is move away from what I think of as artifices of language. There's like hardly any metaphors in that book. The metaphors in that book are kind of metaphors that you can't avoid, like the muffled sound of, something in the snow or something. And she moves so far away from like figurative language, using deixis, which is language that points, like this, that, here, there. And so she gives all these similes, and she writes about the owls who, sound like that. And she doesn't say, And so she's pointing, and the ravens fly through like this, and they look at what they see, she says. And all these things where she refuses to give us, other than the named, beings that are in the landscape with her, she refuses to kind of represent and control them with the artifices of language. And reading it is a very odd experience unless you take the book outside and stand in that space and are like, and this and that, and you feel it. Because she really wants to move us off the page. So it's kind of fun.
Thank you.
Well, speaking of what moves outside of rooms, we should reconvene for lunch. But thank you, Sarah, for the richness and generosity of your talk.
Thank you.